The cabin's rustic charm had always whispered promises of peace, but as I stood there, the scent of pine heavy in the air, I felt anything but serene. Mark, my husband of nearly 2 decades, had suggested this getaway as a break from our daily grind, a chance to reconnect. But now, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the wooden floor, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change irrevocably. Ethan, our adopted son, had been chopping wood, his muscles flexing with each swing of the axe, and in that moment, I felt an unexpected pull towards him, a connection that was both thrilling and terrifying. What was it about Ethan that was drawing me in? And what would this weekend reveal about the secrets we all held close to our hearts? My name is Jessica, a woman who at 40 has crafted a life that many would envy. I live in a quaint suburban home with my husband, Mark, an engineer with a deep-seated love for woodworking, and our adopted son, Ethan, who's 19 and carries a quiet intensity about him. Our lives were a tapestry of routine, each day weaving into the next with the comfort of predictability. But then, one evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Mark suggested something out of the ordinary, a getaway to the mountains, a chance to break from our daily grind. The idea was met with enthusiasm. We packed our bags, the excitement palpable in the air, for a weekend in a secluded cabin nestled among towering pines. As we drove, the conversation was light, filled with plans for hiking, fishing, and nights by the fireplace. Ethan, usually reserved, seemed animated by the prospect of adventure. His eyes, normally shadowed with introspection, sparkled with a rare light. The cabin was rustic, its charm whispering stories of past visitors. The air was crisp, the scenery breathtaking, and as we settled in, I couldn't help but feel a stir of something new, something unexpected in the air. The cabin's interior was warm, with wooden beams and a large stone fireplace that dominated the living area. Mark and Ethan set about unpacking, while I wandered through the rooms, each one holding a promise of solitude and intimacy. That first night, after a dinner of grilled trout and roasted vegetables, we gathered around the fire. The flames danced, casting shadows that seemed to tell tales of their own. Mark, with his usual precision, had brought along his woodworking tools, planning to carve something during our stay. Ethan, meanwhile, had his sketchbook, his fingers tracing lines that would soon become landscapes or perhaps something more personal. As the night deepened, Mark suggested we play a game, something to stir the pot of our usual interactions. We settled on a game of truths, where each of us would share something we'd never told the others. The fire crackled, the only sound in the room as we took turns, revealing layers of ourselves we'd kept hidden. Mark spoke of a time when he nearly left engineering for art, his voice tinged with a wistfulness that made me see him in a new light. Then it was Ethan's turn. He hesitated, his gaze fixed on the fire, then softly began to speak. He talked about his birth parents, a topic he rarely broached. His words were measured, each one carrying the weight of years of silence. He spoke of feeling out of place, of the constant search for identity, and how this trip, this cabin, felt like a place where he could finally breathe. The game continued, and when it was my turn, I shared a secret from my past, a fleeting romance during a summer abroad, one that had left an indelible mark on my heart. The room was silent, the fire's warmth enveloping us, creating a cocoon where confessions felt safe, almost sacred. As the night wore on, the atmosphere shifted subtly. There was an undercurrent of tension, not of conflict, but of something brewing, something unspoken. Mark, perhaps sensing this, suggested we turn in, but the air was charged, and as we retired to our separate rooms, I felt a pull, an urge to explore this new dynamic that had surfaced. In the quiet of our bedroom, Mark and I lay close, the silence between us filled with the echoes of our confessions. His hand found mine, and in that touch, there was an acknowledgement of the unspoken. We didn't speak, but the intimacy was palpable, a silent agreement to explore this newfound vulnerability. The next morning, the cabin felt different, as if our confessions had altered its very essence. The day was spent in a haze of exploration, both of the surrounding woods and of ourselves. Ethan, with his sketchbook, captured the essence of the cabin, while Mark, with his tools, began to carve a piece that seemed to embody our shared revelations. As the weekend unfolded, the cabin became more than just a retreat. It was a crucible where our relationships were being reshaped. The nights by the fire continued, each one peeling back another layer, revealing desires and fears, hopes and regrets. And in those moments I couldn't help but wonder, what could possibly unfold in this serene mountain retreat? What secrets would the mountains whisper to us, and what would we whisper back? The first morning, the cabin was bathed in the golden light of dawn. Mark, ever the planner, had already outlined our day. A hike to the nearby waterfall, followed by some fishing. Ethan, however, was more interested in exploring the woods alone. I watched him, his youthful energy infectious, as he grabbed an axe to chop some firewood for our evening fire. Mark and I set off for our hike, leaving Ethan to his task. The trail was serene, the sounds of nature enveloping us. Yet my thoughts kept drifting back to Ethan, his silhouette against the backdrop of the forest, the rhythmic sound of the axe-splitting wood. There was something about his focus, his strength, that I found myself inexplicably drawn to. What was it about Ethan that was pulling me in? As we walked, Mark's voice broke through my reverie, discussing the logistics of our hike, the best path to take, and the landmarks we should look out for. His voice was steady, comforting, but my mind was elsewhere, caught in the web of my own thoughts. The waterfall was breathtaking, its roar filling the air as we approached. Mark, always the adventurer, suggested we get closer, to feel the mist on our faces. We stood there, the cool spray refreshing, and for a moment I was pulled back into the present, away from the thoughts of Ethan. But as we sat on a nearby rock, catching our breath, my gaze wandered back to the cabin, hidden by the thick foliage. I could almost see Ethan there, his muscles flexing with each swing of the axe, his focus so intense it seemed to carve through the very air. Mark, sensing my distraction, asked, "What's on your mind, Jess?" I hesitated, the words caught in my throat. "Just thinking about the cabin, how peaceful it feels here," I managed, not wanting to delve into the complexity of my feelings. He nodded, understanding, or perhaps choosing to understand, and we continued our hike in a companionable silence, the only sounds being the crunch of leaves underfoot and the distant call of a bird. The hike back was filled with a different kind of tension. Mark was discussing the fishing plans, his excitement palpable, but my mind was still preoccupied with thoughts of Ethan. I imagined him alone in the woods, his solitude a stark contrast to our shared journey. When we returned, Ethan was there, his task completed, sweat beading on his forehead, giving him a glow that seemed almost otherworldly in the dappled sunlight. He looked up, his eyes meeting mine, and for a moment time seemed to pause. There was an unspoken acknowledgement, a silent conversation that left me more confused than ever. Mark, oblivious to this, clapped Ethan on the back, praising his work. "Looks like we'll have a good fire tonight," he said, his voice filled with the simple joy of a man looking forward to an evening by the fire. Ethan smiled, but his eyes lingered on me for a second longer, a look that was both questioning and knowing. It was as if he could see right through me, to the thoughts I was trying to keep at bay. The rest of the day passed in a blur of activity. Mark and I prepared for fishing, setting up our gear, while Ethan retreated to his sketchbook, capturing the essence of the cabin and the surrounding wilderness. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the cabin's porch, we gathered our fishing rods. Mark was in his element, talking about the different types of fish we might catch, the techniques we'd use. His enthusiasm was infectious, and for a while it pulled me away from my internal turmoil. But as we walked to the lake, the image of Ethan, alone with his axe, kept flashing in my mind. There was something about his isolation, his quiet intensity, that resonated with a part of me I hadn't acknowledged before. The fishing was peaceful, the water still, reflecting the sky above. Mark caught a few fish, his laughter echoing across the water, while I sat, my line hardly moving. My thoughts were not on the fish, but on the young man back at the cabin, his presence as palpable as the cool evening air. As we returned, the cabin's lights were a beacon in the growing dusk. Ethan was there, his sketchbook closed, watching us approach. His gaze was steady, and in that moment, I felt an undeniable pull, a connection that was both thrilling and terrifying. Mark, ever the host, suggested we start the fire, and as Ethan moved to help, I couldn't help but watch him, his movements fluid, his strength evident in every motion. The fire crackled to life, casting a warm glow that seemed to highlight the complexity of our emotions, the unspoken currents running beneath our surface interactions. That night, as we sat around the fire, the air was thick with the scent of pine and the unspoken. Mark was talking about the day's catch, but my eyes kept drifting to Ethan, his profile illuminated by the firelight, his presence a constant, silent question. What was it about Ethan that was pulling me in? It was more than just his physicality. It was his quiet strength, his solitude, his unspoken need for connection. And as the night deepened, I knew that this weekend was not just about escaping our routine, but about confronting something within myself, something I had kept hidden, even from Mark. The cabin, with its rustic charm and the whispers of past visitors, was becoming a place of revelation, not just for Ethan, but for me as well. And as I looked at Mark, his face lit by the fire, I wondered what secrets the mountains would whisper to us, and what we would whisper back. After our hike, Mark and I returned to find Ethan had amassed a small pile of firewood. His shirt clung to his skin, sweat glistening in the afternoon light. I offered to help him carry some wood back to the cabin, leaving Mark to prepare lunch. As we walked, the forest seemed to close around us, creating a world of its own. Ethan's conversation was sparse but meaningful, his words carrying a weight that seemed to resonate with something deep within me. We reached a clearing, and without thinking, I touched his arm, thanking him for his hard work. The touch lingered, and in that moment something shifted. The air was charged, and before I knew it, our lips met in a kiss that was both forbidden and exhilarating. The kiss was a whisper of something forbidden, a fleeting moment where time seemed to pause, allowing us to explore a connection that was both thrilling and terrifying. It was a silent agreement, a shared secret that felt like a spark igniting in the quiet of the woods. We returned to the cabin, our secret heavy between us, yet the thrill of the forest lingered. The cabin, with its rustic charm, seemed to hold our secret close, the walls whispering of past secrets and hidden desires. Lunch was a quiet affair. Mark, ever the attentive host, chatted about the fish he planned to catch later, his voice a soothing backdrop to the storm of emotions swirling within me. Ethan sat across from me, his eyes occasionally meeting mine, each glance a reminder of our shared moment. The afternoon passed with a different rhythm. Mark, engrossed in his fishing preparations, was oblivious to the undercurrents between Ethan and me. I found myself watching Ethan as he sketched, his pencil moving with a grace that mirrored the fluidity of our earlier encounter. His focus was intense, yet there was a softness in his expression that hadn't been there before. As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows through the cabin's windows, Mark suggested we go fishing. I hesitated, the thought of being alone with Ethan again both tempting and terrifying. But duty called, and I followed Mark to the lake, leaving Ethan to his sketches. The lake was serene, its surface like a mirror reflecting the sky. Mark was in his element, his enthusiasm for fishing a stark contrast to the turmoil in my heart. I cast my line, but my mind was not on the fish. It was back at the cabin with Ethan, replaying our kiss, the feel of his lips, the rush of adrenaline. Mark caught a few fish, his laughter echoing across the water, a sound that usually brought me joy, but now felt distant. I sat there, my line still, my thoughts a whirlpool of confusion and desire. When we returned, the cabin was bathed in the soft glow of the setting sun. Ethan was there, his sketchbook closed, his gaze steady as he watched us approach. There was an undeniable pull, a connection that felt like a live wire between us. Mark, ever the host, suggested we start the fire. As Ethan moved to help, I couldn't help but watch him, his movements fluid, his strength evident in every motion. The fire crackled to life, casting a warm glow that seemed to highlight the complexity of our emotions, the unspoken currents running beneath our surface interactions. That night, as we sat around the fire, the air was thick with the scent of pine and the unspoken. Mark was talking about the day's catch, but my eyes kept drifting to Ethan, his profile illuminated by the firelight, his presence a constant, silent question. What would happen when the truth came out? The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. The cabin, with its rustic charm and the whispers of past visitors, was becoming a place of revelation, not just for Ethan, but for me as well. And as I looked at Mark, his face lit by the fire. I wondered what secrets the mountains would whisper to us, and what we would whisper back. The night deepened, and with it the silence grew heavier. Ethan's gaze met mine across the fire, a look that was both questioning and knowing. It was as if he could see right through me, to the thoughts I was trying to keep at bay. Mark, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, suggested we play another round of truths. The game, which had started as a way to stir our interactions, now felt like a precipice, a point of no return. Ethan spoke first, his voice soft but clear. "I've been thinking about identity, about where I fit in this world. Today I felt connected in a way I haven't before." His eyes briefly met mine, and I knew he was talking about our moment in the woods. The game continued, each confession peeling back another layer, revealing more of our hidden selves. When it was my turn, I hesitated, the weight of my secret pressing down. "I've felt an attraction, a pull towards someone unexpected," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, not daring to look at Ethan. The room was silent, the fire's warmth enveloping us, creating a cocoon where confessions felt safe, almost sacred. Mark looked at me, his expression unreadable, but there was a flicker of understanding in his eyes. As the night wore on, the tension was palpable. We retired to our rooms, the air charged with the unspoken. In the quiet of our bedroom, Mark and I lay close, the silence between us filled with the echoes of our confessions. His hand found mine, and in that touch, there was an acknowledgement of the unspoken. We didn't speak, but the intimacy was palpable, a silent agreement to explore this newfound vulnerability. The next morning, the cabin felt different, as if our confessions had altered its very essence, changing the atmosphere and our perceptions of one another. The day was spent in a haze of exploration, both of the surrounding woods and of ourselves. Ethan, with his sketchbook, captured the essence of the cabin, while Mark, with his tools, began to carve a piece that seemed to embody our shared revelations. As the weekend unfolded, the cabin became more than just a retreat. It was a crucible where our relationships were being reshaped. The nights by the fire continued, each one peeling back another layer, revealing desires and fears, hopes and regrets. And in those moments, I couldn't help but wonder, what could possibly unfold in this serene mountain retreat? What secrets would the mountains whisper to us? And what would we whisper back? Dinner was a quiet affair, the tension palpable. Mark sensed something was off, but attributed it to the day's fatigue. Ethan and I exchanged glances, each look a silent conversation of what had transpired. After dinner, as Mark stoked the fire, I knew we couldn't keep this hidden. With a deep breath, I began to speak, my voice trembling. "Mark, there's something we need to tell you." I started, my heart pounding in my chest. Ethan's hand found mine under the table, a silent support. Mark paused, the poker hovering over the fire, his back to us. He turned slowly, his face a mask of concern and curiosity. "What is it, Jess?" I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the confession pressing down on me. "Ethan and I, we've shared a moment, a kiss in the woods today." The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in as the fire crackled, almost mocking the silence that followed. Mark's expression didn't change at first, as if he was processing the words, trying to fit them into the reality of our lives. "Okish." His voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried a weight that made my heart sink further. Ethan spoke up, his voice steady, but filled with a mix of regret and defiance. "It was unexpected, Mark. It just happened." Mark looked from Ethan to me, his gaze piercing. "And how do you feel about this, Jess?" I felt the tears prick at the corners of my eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming complexity of my emotions. "I'm confused, Mark. I love you, but there's something about Ethan, something I can't quite explain." Mark sat down heavily in the chair opposite us, his eyes now fixed on the fire. "I see." His voice was calm, too calm, which made the tension even more unbearable. The silence stretched, filled only by the sound of the fire and the distant call of a night bird. Mark finally looked up, his eyes searching mine. "Do you love him?" The question hung in the air, heavy with implications. I shook my head, not in denial but in confusion. "I don't know, Mark. I really don't know. It's not about love, it's about connection, a feeling of being understood." Mark's jaw tightened, his fingers drumming on the armrest. And what about us, Jess? What does this mean for us? I reached out, my hand trembling as I touched his. I don't want to lose what we have, Mark. But I can't ignore what's happening either. I need to understand it to explore it. He pulled his hand away gently, not in anger, but in a gesture of self-preservation. And you, Ethan? Mark's voice was softer now, directed at our son. Ethan's eyes were downcast, his fingers tracing the grain of the wooden table. I'm sorry, Mark. I didn't mean for this to happen. I respect you, I do. But there's something about Jess, something that feels right, even if it's wrong. Mark stood up, pacing to the window, looking out into the darkness. I need some time to think, he said without turning. This changes everything. The room felt colder now, despite the roaring fire. I watched Mark, his silhouette framed by the window, his shoulders tense. The cabin, which had been a place of revelation, now felt like a stage for a drama we were all unwilling actors in. Ethan and I sat in silence, the weight of our confession hanging between us. The fire continued to burn, casting shadows that seemed to dance with our doubts and fears. As the night deepened, the atmosphere was thick with the unspoken. Mark eventually returned to his seat, his face unreadable. We need to figure this out, he said finally. But not tonight. Let's sleep on it. We all nodded, the gravity of the situation settling over us like a heavy blanket. As we retired to our rooms, the air was charged with the unspoken, with the echoes of our confessions. In the quiet of our bedroom, Mark and I lay close, the silence between us filled with the echoes of our confessions. His hand found mine, and in that touch, there was an acknowledgement of the unspoken. We didn't speak, but the intimacy was palpable, a silent agreement to explore this newfound vulnerability. The next morning, the cabin felt different, as if our confessions had altered its very essence. The day was spent in a haze of exploration, both of the surrounding woods and of ourselves. Ethan, with his sketchbook, captured the essence of the cabin, while Mark, with his tools, began to carve a piece that seemed to embody our shared revelations. As the weekend unfolded, the cabin became more than just a retreat. It was a crucible where our relationships were being reshaped. The nights by the fire continued, each one peeling back another layer, revealing desires and fears, hopes and regrets. And in those moments I couldn't help but wonder, what could possibly unfold in this serene mountain retreat? What secrets would the mountains whisper to us, and what would we whisper back? The words spilled out, each one heavier than the last. Mark's face went from confusion to shock, then to a deep, silent hurt. He stood up, his chair scraping against the wooden floor, and walked out of the cabin without a word. The door slammed shut, echoing through the silent night. Ethan and I sat in the aftermath, the fire crackling as if mocking the warmth that had left with Mark. We didn't speak, the gravity of our actions settling around us like the cold mountain air. The room felt empty, the shadows cast by the fire now seemed to dance with a somber rhythm, reflecting the turmoil within. I looked at Ethan, his eyes reflecting the same confusion and regret that churned inside me. What have we done? I whispered, more to myself than to him, but he heard it, his gaze dropping to the floor. The silence was deafening, broken only by the occasional pop from the fire. I felt the weight of the confession, the kiss in the woods, the unspoken desires that had now been voiced, hanging between us like a thick fog. Ethan finally spoke, his voice low. I didn't want this to happen, Jess. Not like this. I nodded, understanding the complexity of his emotions. I know, Ethan. I know. My voice was barely audible, my heart heavy with the implications of our actions. The night stretched on, each tick of the clock in the cabin sounding like a judgment. We sat there, not moving, not speaking, just existing in the space where our family had once been whole. Would this be the end of our family as we knew it? The question loomed over us, oppressive and suffocating. I thought about Mark, out there in the cold, wrestling with betrayal, with confusion, with the very foundation of our life together shaken. I wanted to go after him, to explain, to comfort, but my feet felt like they were rooted to the floor, bound by the complexity of my own emotions. Ethan's hand reached out, touching mine gently, a gesture of solidarity or perhaps an apology. I didn't pull away, but the touch felt different now, laden with the weight of what we had shared, what we had revealed. As the fire began to die down, I stood up, my movements slow, deliberate. "I need to find him," I said, more to the room than to Ethan. He nodded, his face a mask of understanding and pain. I stepped outside, the cold air hitting me like a physical force. The night was dark, the stars obscured by clouds, mirroring the turmoil inside. I called out for Mark, my voice echoing into the silence, but there was no response. I walked towards the path we had taken earlier, the one leading to the waterfall, hoping he might have gone there to think. The forest was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of wildlife absent, as if nature itself was holding its breath, waiting for the outcome of our drama. After what felt like an eternity, I found him sitting on a rock by the waterfall, his silhouette barely visible in the dim light. He didn't turn as I approached, his gaze fixed on the water cascading down, the sound of it almost drowning out the turmoil within me. "Mark," I said softly, standing a few feet away, not daring to come closer without his acknowledgement. He turned then, his eyes meeting mine, and in that look, I saw the depth of his hurt. "Jess," he started, his voice hoarse, "I need to understand. I need to know what this means for us." I moved closer, sitting beside him, the rock cold and damp beneath me. "I don't know, Mark. I'm so confused. I love you, but there's something about Ethan, something I can't explain. It's not about love, it's about connection, understanding." He looked away, back at the waterfall, his jaw clenching. "And what about our family? What about the life we've built?" I reached out, my hand trembling as I touched his arm. "I don't want to lose what we have, Mark. But I can't ignore what's happening either. I need to explore this to understand it." He pulled away slightly, not in anger, but in a gesture of self-preservation. "And what if exploring this means losing everything we've known?" The question hung between us, heavy with implications. I didn't have an answer, not one that would satisfy him or ease the pain. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice breaking. "But I know I can't go back to pretending everything is the same when it's not." We sat there, the sound of the waterfall filling the silence between us, a natural barrier to the words we couldn't find. The cold seeped into my bones, but I didn't move, didn't seek warmth. The chill was a small price to pay for the turmoil in my heart. Eventually, Mark stood up, his movements stiff. "I need time, Jess. Time to think, to process. This isn't just about us. It's about Ethan too." I nodded, understanding the complexity of his request. "Take all the time you need," I said, watching him walk back towards the cabin, his figure disappearing into the darkness. I stayed by the waterfall, the cold air, and the sound of water offering a strange comfort. The night was long, filled with introspection and the echoes of our confessions. As dawn approached, painting the sky with hues of pink and orange, I knew that the cabin, this retreat, had become more than just a place of escape. It was a crucible where our relationships were being reshaped, where truths were being faced, and where the future of our family hung in the balance. What secrets would the mountains whisper to us? And what would we whisper back? The next morning, the cabin felt different, emptier. Mark had taken his things and left in the night, his absence like a void that echoed through the wooden beams. Ethan and I, left alone, decided to continue our stay. The days that followed were filled with a mix of guilt, exploration, and a new complex bond forming between us. We hiked through the dense woods, the silence between us occasionally broken by the crunch of leaves or the distant call of a bird. Each step felt like an exploration not just of the forest, but of our own hearts. We talked, sharing stories of our pasts, our dreams, and our fears. Ethan spoke of his time in foster care, the feeling of being an outsider, and how this trip had begun to change that for him. I listened, feeling the weight of his words, understanding him in ways I hadn't before. As we walked, I found myself drawn to his quiet strength, the way he absorbed the world around him, capturing it in his sketches. His focus was intense, his lines on the paper as deliberate as the steps we took through the underbrush. There was a new understanding growing between us, a bond that was both thrilling and terrifying in its implications. The nights were spent by the fire, the flames casting shadows that danced with our unspoken thoughts. We didn't play any more games of truths, but the truth was there, hanging in the air like the smoke from the fire. We were both grappling with what had happened, with what it meant for us, for Mark, for our family. Ethan's sketches began to fill with more than just landscapes. They now included moments from our time here, capturing the essence of our new connection. One evening, as he showed me his latest drawing, our hands brushed, and the touch was electric, charged with the complexity of our situation. We didn't speak of the kiss, but it was there, a silent acknowledgement in every glance, every shared moment. The cabin, once a place of escape, had become a crucible for our emotions, reshaping our relationships in ways we were still discovering. When we returned home, the house was silent, Mark's absence a loud echo in every room. The familiar walls seemed to judge us, to remind us of the life we had before the mountains. We knew we had to face the consequences of our actions, but for now we had each other, and the mountains had changed us in ways we were still uncovering. Ethan and I sat in the living room, the same room where we had played our game of truths, where everything had begun to unravel. The silence was heavy, filled with the weight of our confessions and the uncertainty of our future. "What do we do now, Jess?" Ethan's voice was soft, his eyes searching mine for answers I didn't have. I took a deep breath, feeling the gravity of the situation. "We need to talk to Mark to understand where he stands, where we stand. This isn't just about us anymore." He nodded, his gaze dropping to the floor. "I know. I didn't expect this. I didn't want to hurt anyone." I reached out, my hand finding his, a gesture of comfort, of solidarity. "I know, Ethan. Neither did I. But we can't undo what's been done. We can only move forward, figure out what this means for all of us." The days that followed were a blur of waiting, of trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. Mark's absence was a constant reminder of the fracture in our family. Ethan and I continued to share moments, our bond deepening, yet always under the shadow of what we had done, of what we might lose. One evening, as we sat in the kitchen, the phone rang, breaking the silence. It was Mark. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, a distance that hadn't been there before. "Jess, we need to talk," he said, his words measured. I felt Ethan tense beside me, his hand squeezing mine. "Yes, Mark. We do. When can we meet?" "Tomorrow. At the park. Just you for now." The call ended, and the silence returned, heavier than before. Ethan looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of fear and resolve. "What do you think he'll say?" I shook my head, the uncertainty overwhelming. "I don't know, Ethan. But we'll face it together." The next day, I met Mark at the park, the same place where we had once had picnics as a family. He was sitting on a bench, his back to me, watching the children play. I approached slowly, the crunch of gravel under my feet announcing my arrival. "Mark," I said softly, sitting beside him. He turned, his eyes meeting mine, and I saw the depth of his hurt, the confusion. "Jess, I've been thinking a lot. About us, about Ethan, about everything." I nodded, waiting for him to continue, my heart pounding in my chest. "I love you, Jess. And I love Ethan. But what happened? It's changed things. I need time to understand it, to see if we can move past this." I reached out, my hand trembling as I touched his. "I understand, Mark. I'm so sorry for the pain we've caused. I want to work through this, to find a way forward together." He looked away, his jaw clenching. "I don't know if that's possible, Jess. Not right now. I need space, time to think." The words hung between us, heavy with implications. I didn't have an answer, not one that would satisfy him or ease the pain. "I know," I admitted, my voice breaking. "But I'm here, Mark. Whenever you're ready." He stood up, his movements stiff. "I'll be in touch, Jess. But for now I need to be alone." I watched him walk away, his figure disappearing into the crowd, leaving me with the weight of our fractured family. Returning home, I found Ethan waiting, his expression anxious. "How did it go?" I sat beside him, taking his hand. "He needs time, Ethan. Time to think, to process. We have to give him that." Ethan nodded, his eyes reflecting the same turmoil I felt. "And us, Jess? What about us?" I looked at him, at the young man who had become so much more than just our adopted son. "We'll figure it out, Ethan. Together. But for now, we need to respect Mark's need for space." The days turned into weeks, each one filled with the silent tension of waiting, of wondering what the future held. Ethan and I continued to grow closer, our bond deepening, yet always shadowed by the uncertainty of Mark's return, of what our family would look like moving forward. What would the future hold for Jessica and Ethan, now bound by more than just family ties? The question lingered, a constant whisper in the back of our minds, as we navigated the new complex landscape of our lives. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment if you enjoyed this story. This will help us create more engaging stories for you.